Of course. Here is the paraphrased script, maintaining the original tone and style while altering the sentence structures and word order. In the winter of 1892, whispers began to chill the residents of Mexico City's most prestigious neighborhood. From behind the elegant stone walls of a mansion on Tuba Street came screams so piercing, so filled with agony, that even hardened policemen would later claim their dreams were haunted by them for years. These were not the commonplace cries of revolution or street violence in Fio Diaz's Mexico. They were something far worse. The systematic torture of children, carried out with methodical precision by a woman whose respectable facade had fooled an entire society. What authorities discovered inside that house would shake Mexico to its core, revealing the mind of the country's first documented female serial killer. A woman whose crimes were so depraved that the famous artist José Guadalupe Bejarano would immortalize her evil in illustrations that still disturb viewers to this day. Before we continue with the story of Guadalupe Martinez de Bejarano, known to history as Labor, the Terrifying One. If true crime stories that reveal the darkest corners of human nature fascinate you, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. If you dare to uncover the complete truth, like this video, and let us know in the comments what state and city you're listening from. These disturbing cases that time tried to bury continue to be investigated thanks to your support. The story I'm about to tell you has been largely forgotten, buried beneath decades of shame and disbelief. But it deserves to be told, not for its shock value, but because it reveals how evil can hide behind the most respectable facades, and how society's blind spots can become hunting grounds for predators. The year was 1887, and Mexico City pulsed with the contradictions of President Fio Diaz's ambitious modernization project. Gas lamps flickered along newly paved streets where horse-drawn carriages carried ladies in imported European silks past beggars who hadn't eaten in days. The wealthy districts showcased Mexico's aspirations to join the ranks of civilized nations, while just blocks away, indigenous families crowded into crumbling tenements, their children thin with hunger and desperation. In this world of brutal inequality, Guadalupe Martinez de Bejarano commanded respect. At 43, she was a widow of impeccable reputation, who had maintained her late husband's social standing through shrewd business dealings and careful cultivation of relationships with Mexico City's elite. Her imposing two-story mansion on Tuba Street, with its wrought iron balconies and pink limestone facade, reflected the dignity expected of a woman of her class. A formidable presence was Guadalupe herself. Tall and austere, she wore her black widow's weeds-like armor, her dark hair pulled severely back in a style that emphasized the sharp angles of her face. Her neighbors knew her as a devout Catholic who never missed Sunday Mass, a generous contributor to church charities, and a businesswoman who provided domestic servants to the city's finest families. What they didn't know was that Guadalupe had developed what she privately called her special method of training young servants. Behind the mansion's locked doors, she had created a laboratory of human suffering in her servants' quarters, a place where she could explore the darkest impulses that proper society demanded she suppress. Her son, Aurelio, now 22, lived in the mansion's upper floors like a ghost, thin and nervous, with the pale complexion of someone who spent too much time indoors. He had grown up learning to make himself invisible whenever his mother's eyes took on that particular glitter that preceded what she called discipline sessions. An uncontrollable stutter and a dependency on laudanum had developed in him, which helped him sleep through the sounds that came from below. Guadalupe's business model was perfectly designed for her hidden activities. Desperate families from Mexico's impoverished rural areas sent their daughters to the capital seeking work as domestic servants. These girls arrived with no connections, no documents, and often no ability to read or write. When they disappeared, there was rarely anyone with the social standing to ask uncomfortable questions. But during her early years of experimentation, Guadalupe had been careful. She had limited herself to what she called minor corrections, punishments that left no permanent marks, humiliations that could be explained as character building. It wasn't until 1887 that she took the final step into murder. The morning of January 18, 1887, dawned gray and cold over Mexico City. A thin mist rose from the ancient lake bed that still underlaid much of the capital, giving the streets an otherworldly quality that seemed to muffle sound and blur the edges of reality. It was on this morning that Casimí Juárez, a 16-year-old girl from the mountains of Mitocan, knocked on the carved wooden door of Guadalupe Bejarano's mansion. For 6 days, Case Myra had traveled to reach the capital, carrying everything she owned in a small cloth bundle. Her parents had died in a cholera outbreak the previous year, leaving her with no family and no prospects in her village. The parish priest had given her a letter of recommendation and the address of Senora Bejarano, who was known throughout the region for her charitable work in placing young women in respectable positions. When Guadalupe opened the door, her practiced eye immediately assessed the girl before her. Case Myra was exactly what she looked for: young, vulnerable, alone, and bearing that particular expression of desperate gratitude that marked those who had no other options. Her dark hair was neatly braided, her simple dress was clean but patched, and her large eyes held a mixture of hope and fear that Guadalupe found deeply satisfying. "I can see you've been raised properly," Guadalupe said as she examined the priest's letter, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Good references are essential in my household. I maintain very high standards." She led Cassimi through the mansion's marble-floored halls, past religious paintings and heavy furniture that spoke of old money and conservative values. The girl's room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a wash basin, and a crucifix on the wall. "You'll find that I treat my servants fairly," Guadalupe explained. "But I expect absolute obedience and discretion. The families I serve demand nothing less." For the first 2 weeks, Casimira's life in the mansion followed a routine that seemed almost pleasant after the hardship she had known. She woke before dawn to help prepare breakfast, spent her mornings cleaning the main rooms, and her afternoons assisting with laundry and mending. Guadalupe watched her constantly, but the girl interpreted this as the natural supervision of a careful employer. What Case Myra didn't understand was that she was being studied with the intensity of a scientist observing a laboratory specimen. Guadalupe catalogued every aspect of the girl's behavior: how she reacted to criticism, what made her afraid, how much physical discomfort she could endure before tears appeared in her eyes. She was planning something that required precise knowledge of her subject's breaking points. The transformation began gradually. Guadalupe started finding fault with Casimiro's work: dust that was invisible to anyone else, wrinkles in perfectly smooth linens, food that was somehow inadequately prepared despite following recipes exactly. The girl would apologize profusely and work harder, which only seemed to intensify her employer's criticism. "I'm beginning to think you're not as well trained as your priest claimed," Guadalupe said one evening, her voice carrying a chill that made Case Myra shiver. "Perhaps what you need is more intensive instruction in proper behavior." The punishment started small. Case Myra was made to stand motionless in the kitchen for hours as penance for imaginary infractions. Meals were denied to her for being clumsy when she stumbled due to exhaustion. She was required to scrub floors on her hands and knees until her palms bled, then criticized for getting blood on the stone. Aurelio, watching from the shadows, felt his stomach clench with familiar dread. He had seen this pattern before with other servants, though never carried so far. When he tried to speak to his mother about her treatment of the girl, Guadalupe's response was swift and terrifying. "I see you've forgotten who maintains this household," she said, her eyes growing cold as winter stone. "Perhaps you'd like to join Case Myra in her lessons about respect and obedience." The threat was clear. Aurelio retreated to his room and increased his laudanum dosage, trying to numb himself to what he knew was coming. By February, Casimira's world had become a waking nightmare. What had begun as harsh discipline had evolved into systematic torture designed to break her spirit before destroying her body. Guadalupe had moved beyond simple cruelty into territory that revealed the true extent of her psychological disturbance. The basement of the mansion, originally designed as storage space, had been converted into what Guadalupe privately thought of as her training room. Here, away from any possibility of interference, she could conduct her experiments in human suffering without restraint. Case Myra was stripped of her clothes and forced to stand naked in the cold stone room while Guadalupe circled her like a predator, pointing out each imperfection that required correction. The girl's malnourished body showed every rib, every sharp angle of malnutrition that Guadalupe had deliberately induced through starvation. "You see how ugly you've become," Guadalupe whispered, her voice carrying an intimacy that was somehow more terrifying than shouting. "This is what happens when servants forget their place." But don't worry, I'm going to help you remember. The brazier that normally heated the mansion's rooms became an instrument of torture. Guadalupe would heat iron implements until they glowed red, then slowly bring them close to Casimira's skin, watching her face contort with terror before the pain even began. The actual contact was brief but precise, designed to cause maximum agony while avoiding burns that might prove immediately fatal. Between torture sessions, Guadalupe would tend to the girl's wounds with medical precision, applying salves that promoted healing just quickly enough to allow the process to be repeated. She had studied anatomy and physiology with the dedication of a physician, learning exactly how much damage the human body could sustain and recover from. The psychological torture was equally methodical. Guadalupe forced Cassimi to confess to sins she had never committed, to beg forgiveness for imaginary transgressions, to express gratitude for punishments that pushed her closer to madness. With each passing day, she broke down the girl's sense of reality until Casimira began to believe she truly deserved the suffering being inflicted upon her. Aurelio, trapped in the floors above, tried desperately to maintain his sanity while the sounds of torture echoed through the mansion's walls. He began keeping a journal, scrawling desperate observations in handwriting that grew more erratic with each entry. February 15th. The screaming was worse last night. I tried to cover my ears, but it comes through everything. Mother says it's necessary for the girl's moral improvement, but her eyes when she says this. God help me. I think she enjoys it. February 22nd. Found blood on the stairs leading to the cellar. When I asked about it, Mother smiled and said there had been an accident during cooking lessons. But what kind of cooking lesson requires that much blood? February 28th. Haven't seen Casimira in the main house for days. Mother says she's too ill to work, but I hear sounds from below that don't sound like illness. They sound like... I can't write what they sound like. The end came in early March after nearly 6 weeks of systematic torture. Casimira's body, pushed beyond all limits of human endurance, finally surrendered. Her heart simply stopped beating during what Guadalupe had planned as another routine session of correction. When Guadalupe realized her victim was dead, she felt an unexpected mixture of satisfaction and disappointment. The process had provided her with the most intense pleasure she had ever experienced. But now it was over, and she faced the practical problem of disposal. With the methodical efficiency she applied to all her projects, Guadalupe wrapped the body in old sheets and waited until the darkest hours before dawn to load it onto a cart. She had already selected a burial site in the vacant lots that surrounded the city's expanding edges, a place where the soft earth would accept secrets without question. As she dug the shallow grave that would hide Mexico's first known victim of female serial murder, Guadalupe made a decision that would define the rest of her life. The experience had awakened something in her that demanded to be fed. She would be more careful next time, more selective about her victims, more sophisticated in her methods, but there would definitely be a next time. Following Casimira's murder, Guadalupe entered what she thought of as her professional phase. She had learned valuable lessons from her first kill and was determined not to repeat the mistakes that had nearly led to discovery. The key was patience, planning, and maintaining the reputation that served as her most effective camouflage. For nearly a year, she threw herself into legitimate business activities with renewed vigor. She organized charity fundraisers for the local cathedral, expanded her domestic placement service, and cultivated relationships with Mexico City's most influential families. By day, she was the picture of respectable widowhood, devout, industrious, and socially conscious. But her nights were devoted to planning. She studied the social patterns that would help her select ideal victims, researched methods of restraint and torture that would be more efficient than her crude early experiments, and most importantly, developed systems for ensuring that disappearances would generate minimal investigation. She also worked carefully to manage Aurelio's increasing psychological instability. Her son had become dangerously unpredictable, prone to sudden outbursts of weeping and rambling monologues about imaginary sins that required confession. Guadalupe arranged for him to receive treatment from a German physician who specialized in nervous disorders, ensuring that his testimony would be dismissed as the ravings of an invalid if he ever tried to expose her activities. The opportunity she had been waiting for arrived in September 1888 when Maria Santos brought her 15-year-old daughter Elena to the mansion seeking employment. The Santos family had lost their farm to drought and debt, forcing them to migrate to the capital where work was scarce and competition fierce. Maria was desperate enough to accept any position for her daughter regardless of the conditions. Elena Santos was everything Guadalupe looked for in a victim. She was young, healthy, and isolated from any support system that might investigate her disappearance. More importantly, she possessed a quiet strength that Guadalupe found irresistible. Breaking strong spirits provided far more satisfaction than destroying those who were already defeated. The girl's initial weeks in the mansion followed the same pattern Guadalupe had established with Casimiara, but with important refinements. She was more subtle in her escalation of abuse, more careful to ensure that each stage of degradation seemed to follow logically from the previous one. Instead of sudden violence, she employed gradual psychological manipulation that confused her victim's sense of reality. "I notice you've been making more mistakes lately," Guadalupe would observe with apparent concern. "Perhaps the city air doesn't agree with you. Some girls from the countryside never adjust properly to civilized living." Elena would protest that she was trying her best, which only prompted lectures about the difference between effort and achievement. Guadalupe cultivated an atmosphere of constant judgment where nothing the girl did was ever quite adequate, creating a psychological environment ripe for more serious abuse. The physical punishments began as corrections for increasingly imaginary faults. A spot missed during cleaning led to hours standing motionless as punishment. A dish served at slightly the wrong temperature resulted in meals being withheld. A perceived look of defiance earned an evening locked in the coal cellar without light or warmth. But Guadalupe had learned to be patient. She allowed days or even weeks to pass between escalations, giving Elena time to adjust to each new level of abuse before introducing the next. This methodical approach prevented the girl from recognizing the overall pattern until she was too psychologically damaged to resist effectively. Aurelio, observing this process with growing horror, made several attempts to intervene. But his mother had anticipated this possibility and developed strategies for controlling his interference. "I see you're concerned about Ellena's training," she told him after he questioned why the girl seemed so frightened. "That shows you have a kind heart, but kindness without wisdom can be cruel. These country girls need firm guidance to overcome their natural laziness and deceit. Would you rather I send her back to the streets where she'll surely fall into prostitution and sin?" When Aurelio persisted in his objections, Guadalupe's tone became more threatening. "Of course, if you feel you understand domestic management better than I do, you're welcome to take responsibility for the girl's moral development yourself. I'm sure you'd find it educational." The implication was clear. Aurelio had seen enough of his mother's methods to understand that crossing her meant joining her victims. He retreated to his lordom and his journal, documenting horrors he was too terrified to prevent. By December 1888, Elena Santos had been transformed from a healthy country girl into a hollow-eyed shadow who flinched at every sound and obeyed commands with the mechanical precision of someone whose will had been systematically destroyed. Guadalupe had perfected her techniques during the months of preparation, developing methods of torture that were both more sophisticated and more prolonged than anything she had inflicted on Casimira. The basement room had been renovated with equipment specifically designed for restraint and suffering. Chains hung from ceiling beams, their iron links worn smooth by struggling hands. A brazier stood in one corner, surrounded by implements that had been heated and cooled so many times their metal had taken on a blue-black patina. Most disturbing of all was a chair-like apparatus that Guadalupe had commissioned from a blacksmith, ostensibly for invalid care, but actually designed to hold a victim motionless while allowing access to every part of their body. Elena's final ordeal lasted 3 days. Guadalupe had planned it with the precision of a theatrical performance, with each act designed to build upon the previous one's psychological and physical devastation. She alternated between periods of intense torture and intervals of false kindness, keeping her victim constantly off balance and unable to predict what would come next. "You see, my dear," Guadalupe explained during one of these brief respites while applying salve to burns that she herself had inflicted hours earlier. "This is all for your own good. Every soul must be purified before it can enter heaven. And some souls require more purification than others." The religious justification was new, a development that showed how Guadalupe had integrated her crimes into a worldview that allowed her to see herself as righteous rather than evil. She had convinced herself that she was performing a sacred service, saving souls through suffering in ways that conventional religion was too squeamish to attempt. When Elena finally died, her heart stopping during a session that Guadalupe had intended to continue for several more hours, the killer felt a frustration that was almost physical in its intensity. The anticipation had been so carefully built, the progression so meticulously planned that the premature ending felt like artistic failure rather than human tragedy. But she had learned valuable lessons about pacing and methodology. Her next victim would benefit from these improvements and the experience would be correspondingly more satisfying. The burial followed the same pattern as before, but with additional precautions. Guadalupe had identified multiple disposal sites around the city's periphery, reducing the risk that multiple graves in one location might eventually be discovered. She also took care to vary the timing of her nocturnal expeditions, ensuring that no pattern would emerge that might attract attention from night watchmen or early rising workers. When Maria Santos appeared at the mansion 3 weeks later, frantic with worry about her daughter's unexplained silence, Guadalupe was prepared with a story that had been crafted to deflect suspicion while discouraging further investigation. "I'm afraid Elena became quite ill shortly after Christmas," she explained with practiced sympathy. "A fever that seemed to affect her mind as much as her body. She became convinced that her family was in danger and insisted on leaving immediately to warn you. I tried to persuade her to wait until she was well enough to travel safely. But you know how stubborn young people can be when they're worried about their loved ones." The story was plausible enough to satisfy a desperate mother's need for explanations and vague enough to make verification impossible. Maria Santos left the mansion believing her daughter was making her way home through Mexico's dangerous countryside, never suspecting that Elena's bones were already being picked clean by scavengers in a shallow grave outside the city. The period between Elena Santos's murder in late 1888 and Guadalupe's next killings in 1892 represented the apex of her criminal sophistication. She had learned to control her impulses, channeling her homicidal urges into careful planning and victim selection while maintaining a public facade that grew more convincing with each passing year. During this time, she established herself as one of Mexico City's most prominent charitable figures. She organized relief efforts for earthquake victims, sponsored orphanages, and contributed so generously to church construction projects that the Archbishop himself praised her Christian devotion from the pulpit. This public recognition served as the perfect shield for her private activities, making any accusations against her seem not just unlikely, but sacrilegious. She also expanded her domestic placement business into a sophisticated operation that gave her access to vulnerable young women from across central Mexico. Her reputation for reliability and discretion made her the preferred employment agent for the capital's elite families, while her supposed commitment to moral instruction attracted desperate parents who saw domestic service as their daughter's only escape from rural poverty. What these families didn't realize was that Guadalupe had developed a complex screening process for identifying ideal victims. She looked for girls who were isolated from family support, psychologically vulnerable, and physically attractive enough to satisfy her increasingly specific preferences. Most importantly, she sought those who possessed the kind of inner strength that would make their eventual breaking particularly satisfying. Aurelio's condition during this period provided an unexpected advantage. His nervous disorder had progressed to the point where he was largely confined to his rooms, dependent on increasing doses of laudanum and opium that kept him in a perpetual haze of semi-consciousness. When he did venture into public, his obvious instability made him an unreliable witness whose testimony could be easily discredited. Guadalupe carefully cultivated this perception, ensuring that doctors and family friends saw Aurelio's condition as the tragic result of inherited mental weakness rather than psychological trauma. She commissioned expensive treatments from fashionable alienists, publicly demonstrating her commitment to her son's recovery while privately ensuring that his condition remained too unstable for him to pose any real threat to her activities. But beneath this carefully maintained surface, Guadalupe was planning her most ambitious project yet. The deaths of Case Myra and Elena had satisfied her immediate urges while teaching her valuable lessons about methodology and victim management. Now she was ready to attempt something far more complex, the simultaneous captivity and torture of multiple victims, a scenario that would allow her to explore new dimensions of psychological manipulation and physical suffering. The opportunity came in the spring of 1892 when Esperanza Vega brought her two younger sisters to Mexico City seeking domestic positions. The Vega family had been destroyed by a combination of crop failure and political violence in their home state of Hidalgo, leaving Esperanza responsible for her sister's survival at the age of just 19. Guadalupe interviewed all three girls with the careful attention of someone evaluating precious acquisitions. Esperanza was tall and strong with the kind of determined dignity that Guadalupe found irresistible in victims. Carmen, 17, was quieter and more obviously frightened, while 15-year-old Rosa displayed a quick intelligence that suggested she might be capable of organizing resistance if not properly managed. "I can certainly use all three of you," Guadalupe told them with the maternal warmth that had become her most effective tool of deception. In fact, it would be ideal to have sisters working together. You can support each other through the adjustment period, and I find that family members are naturally more motivated to maintain the high standards I require. What she didn't tell them was that she had been planning for exactly this scenario, developing techniques that would allow her to use family bonds as instruments of torture rather than sources of strength. Just when we thought we'd seen the depths of Guadalupe Bejarano's depravity, the horror in Mexico City intensifies beyond imagination. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens when a monster realizes that destroying one soul at a time simply isn't enough to satisfy her appetite for suffering. The arrival of the Vega sisters marked the beginning of Guadalupe's most sophisticated and prolonged campaign of torture. Having learned from her previous experiences, she now understood that the key to maximum satisfaction lay not in the speed of destruction, but in the careful cultivation of despair over extended periods. For the first month, all three sisters were treated with the apparent kindness that had become Guadalupe's trademark. They were given adequate food, reasonable work assignments, and even small privileges like occasional afternoons off to explore the city together. This period of false security was crucial to Guadalupe's overall strategy. She needed her victims to develop emotional attachments to their situation before she began to systematically destroy everything they valued. The psychological manipulation began subtly, with Guadalupe gradually introducing divisions between the sisters. She would praise one girl's work while criticizing another's for identical performance. She created situations where the sisters had to compete for privileges, fostering resentment and suspicion where there had previously been solidarity. "I've noticed that Rosa seems to be adjusting better than her sisters," she would observe to Esperanza during their private conversations. "Some people are naturally more suited to civilized living. Perhaps Carmen would benefit from spending more time with me personally, learning the refinements that come so naturally to Rosa." These seemingly innocent comments were designed to plant seeds of guilt and anxiety that would later bloom into full psychological torment. Esperanza began to second-guess her decision to bring her sisters to Mexico City, while Carmen developed a desperate need to prove herself worthy of approval. By June 1892, Guadalupe had successfully isolated each sister psychologically while maintaining their physical proximity. They shared the same quarters but no longer trusted each other completely, each secretly believing that she might be failing to meet standards that her sisters were somehow managing to achieve. This was when Guadalupe introduced the basement room to her new victims. The basement that had served as Elena Santos's final prison had been extensively modified during Guadalupe's years of planning. She had commissioned new equipment that allowed for more precise restraint and positioning, invested in medical instruments that enabled more controlled infliction of pain, and most importantly designed the space to accommodate multiple victims simultaneously. The room now contained 3 of the chair-like restraint devices positioned so that each occupant would have a clear view of the other's suffering. This arrangement was central to Guadalupe's evolved methodology. She had discovered that forcing victims to witness each other's torture multiplied the psychological impact exponentially while providing her with multiple sources of stimulation during each session. The first time the Vega sisters were brought to the basement, Guadalupe maintained the pretense that this was simply another form of household instruction. "I've prepared a special training program for you," she explained with the calm authority that her victims had learned to fear. "Some aspects of proper service require more intensive instruction than others. This room has been designed specifically for that purpose." The sisters were secured in the restraint chairs without being harmed, allowed to experience the helplessness of their position, while Guadalupe explained her expectations with the patient tone of a teacher addressing particularly slow students. The most important quality in a domestic servant is absolute obedience, she began, walking slowly around the room so that each girl had to strain to keep her in sight. Obedience requires understanding, and understanding sometimes requires experiences that may seem unpleasant at first, but I promise you that everything that happens in this room will ultimately be for your benefit. She then demonstrated the room's capabilities by inflicting relatively minor punishments on each sister in turn, brief applications of heated implements that caused pain without permanent damage, controlled drowning experiences that induced panic without actual danger, carefully measured electrical shocks from a primitive battery device that a corrupt physician had provided for her experiments. Throughout these demonstrations, she maintained a running commentary that mixed practical instruction with philosophical justification, creating a surreal atmosphere where torture was presented as education and suffering as privilege. "You see, Carmen, how your resistance only makes this more difficult for everyone," she would observe while applying burning metal to the girl's shoulder. "And notice, Rosa, how your sister's selfishness is preventing me from moving on to more pleasant activities. Perhaps you'd like to encourage her to be more cooperative." This technique, forcing victims to witness and indirectly participate in each other's suffering, proved devastatingly effective. Within weeks, the sisters had been transformed from a united family into isolated individuals who would compete desperately for any slight reduction in their torment, even if it meant accepting increased suffering for their siblings. Esperanza, as the eldest, suffered the additional torment of feeling responsible for her sister's situation. Guadalupe exploited this ruthlessly, frequently reminding the girl that Carmen and Rosa were suffering because of her decision to bring them to Mexico City. "This could all stop so easily," Guadalupe would whisper during the extended sessions that became routine evening entertainment. "All you have to do is ask me to transfer their punishments to you. I'm sure they would appreciate such sisterly devotion." When Esperanza inevitably made this sacrifice, Guadalupe would accept it temporarily before announcing that the other sisters needed to share responsibility for their eldest sister's suffering. The psychological maze she constructed had no exit. Every choice led to greater pain. Every gesture of love became a weapon for inflicting additional torment. By late 1892, even Guadalupe's considerable skill at maintaining appearances was being strained by the intensity of her activities. The systematic torture of 3 victims simultaneously required enormous amounts of time and energy, leaving her frequently exhausted and occasionally careless about maintaining her public facade. Aurelio, despite his heavily drugged condition, had begun to notice changes in his mother's behavior that frightened him more than her previous cruelties. She had started talking to herself during meals, conducting conversations with invisible participants about techniques and improvements. She had lost weight dramatically. Her eyes had taken on a feverish brightness, and she sometimes forgot to maintain the careful grooming that had always been central to her public image. Most disturbing of all, she had begun to invite him to observe her work. "I think you're old enough now to understand what I've been trying to accomplish," she told him one evening in December. "Your education has been incomplete without exposure to the realities of human nature. Perhaps it's time you learned what people are really capable of when properly motivated." Aurelio managed to refuse these invitations through a combination of feigned illness and increased drug consumption, but he could feel his mother's patience with his avoidance wearing thin. He began to suspect that his next refusal might result in his joining the sisters in the basement. This fear prompted him to take the first decisive action of his adult life. Using lucid intervals between drug doses, he began to document everything he had observed over the years of his mother's criminal activities. His journal entries became more detailed and specific, focusing on times, dates, and descriptions that could serve as evidence if he ever found the courage to present them to authorities. December 15, 1892. Heard 3 distinct voices screaming from the basement last night. Mother says she has only taken on 2 new servants, but I know what I heard. She also stayed down there until nearly dawn, far longer than any legitimate household instruction would require. December 20, 1892. Found bloodstained clothing in mother's room while looking for additional laudanum. When I asked about it, she smiled and said she had been helping with medical instruction for the servants. But what kind of medical instruction requires that much blood? December 28, 1892. Mother asked me again to join her in the basement. When I refused, she said that I was old enough to take on adult responsibilities whether I wanted to or not. I think she means to force me to participate in whatever she's doing down there. The crisis that would ultimately expose Guadalupe's crimes began on New Year's Day 1893 when a routine visit from the parish priest nearly resulted in discovery. Father Miguel Herrera had come to deliver Guadalupe's annual charitable contribution receipt and discuss plans for the upcoming Lenten season, but his visit coincided with one of her extended basement sessions. The priest was kept waiting in the main parlor while Guadalupe frantically tried to conclude her activities and make herself presentable, but the sounds echoing from below the house were too loud and too obviously distressing to be explained away as normal household activities. "See Nora Bejarano?" Father Herrera asked with obvious concern. "Is someone ill in your household?" "Those sounds suggest someone is in considerable distress." Guadalupe's explanation that one of her servants was suffering from a fever that caused delirium satisfied the priest temporarily, but his suspicions had been aroused. As Mexico City's most prominent charitable lady, Guadalupe was accustomed to clerical visits, but she had never before seemed so agitated or eager to conclude their meetings. Father Herrera began making subtle inquiries among his parishioners about the Bejarano household. What he learned troubled him deeply. Several neighbors reported that the sounds from the mansion had grown increasingly disturbing over the past months. The usual complaints about domestic discipline had evolved into something far more serious, screams that lasted for hours, the smell of burning flesh that occasionally drifted from the property's windows, and the complete absence of the young servants who were supposedly living there. More damaging still was the testimony of tradesmen who had done business with the household. A blacksmith reported being commissioned to create restraining devices that seemed far more elaborate than anything required for managing difficult servants. A physician admitted to providing Guadalupe with medical instruments and drugs that had no legitimate domestic use. Most disturbing of all, several shopkeepers noted that Guadalupe's purchases of food had decreased dramatically despite her claims of maintaining a larger household staff. As winter deepened into the early months of 1893, Guadalupe's activities reached a crescendo of depravity that pushed even her considerable capacity for cruelty into uncharted territory. The systematic torture of the Vega sisters had continued for over 6 months, transforming them from healthy young women into broken shadows who existed in a state of constant terror. Esperanza, who had once been the family's protector and decision-maker, now spent her days in a catatonic state, broken only by periods of violent hysteria when she was subjected to fresh torments. Her body bore the evidence of every refinement Guadalupe had developed in her torture techniques, precisely placed burns that formed patterns across her skin, carefully inflicted cuts that had been allowed to heal and reopen multiple times, and evidence of internal injuries that spoke to violations too horrific to detail. Carmen had developed a different response to the prolonged abuse. She had retreated so far into madness that she often seemed genuinely unaware of what was happening to her, speaking to invisible companions and laughing at horrors that should have induced screaming. This detachment from reality both frustrated and fascinated Guadalupe, who saw it as a challenge to develop new methods that could penetrate even complete psychological withdrawal. Rosa, the youngest, had somehow retained more of her sanity than her sisters. But this clarity only made her suffering more acute. She was fully aware of what was happening to her family and understood with terrible precision that their situation could only end in death. Her attempts to negotiate with Guadalupe to find some arrangement that might save at least her sisters provided their captor with endless entertainment as she raised and crushed hopes with calculated precision. But Guadalupe had begun to realize that even this elaborate scenario was approaching its natural conclusion. The sisters were dying slowly from the accumulated damage of their torture, and their deaths would leave her once again without victims to satisfy her ever-growing appetite for suffering. This recognition prompted her to make the decision that would ultimately destroy her. She began planning to acquire new victims even before disposing of the current ones, intending to maintain a continuous supply of subjects for her experiments. The opportunity seemed to present itself when Julia Mendez, a widow from Querétaro, arrived in Mexico City with her 14-year-old daughter Isabella, seeking domestic work to survive after losing their family farm to creditors. Guadalupe saw Isabella as the perfect addition to her collection, young enough to be completely controlled, old enough to provide sophisticated entertainment, and isolated enough to disappear without generating immediate investigation. but her eagerness to acquire this new victim led her to make crucial mistakes. Instead of waiting for the Vega sisters to die naturally from their accumulated injuries, she decided to accelerate their deaths to make room for Isabella. More fatally, she underestimated how far her son Aurelio's documentation efforts had progressed and how close he was to finding the courage to act on his knowledge. The night of February 14, 1893, marked the end of Guadalupe Bejarano's career as Mexico's most successful serial killer. She had planned what she intended as the final session with the Vega sisters, a culminating experience that would eliminate them while providing maximum satisfaction before she began working with Isabella Mendez. But Aurelio, fortified by a combination of laudanum-induced courage and desperate terror about his own fate, had made a decision that would change everything. During the weeks of planning, he had been secretly communicating with Father Herrera, providing the priest with detailed information about his mother's activities while begging for protection from the consequences of his revelations. The evidence he provided was overwhelming. His journals contained precise dates and descriptions of torture sessions, victim acquisitions, and body disposals that went back years. He had sketched the layout of the basement torture chamber, documented the location of burial sites outside the city, and most damning of all, provided testimony about his mother's psychological state that painted her as a methodical sadist rather than a woman driven temporarily insane by grief or circumstance. Father Herrera, horrified by these revelations but uncertain how to proceed without endangering Aurelio, had spent weeks consulting with church authorities and civil officials. The problem was that Guadalupe's social standing made accusations against her extremely dangerous to pursue without absolutely ironclad evidence. A failed prosecution would destroy not only Aurelio, but anyone involved in bringing charges. The solution came when Aurelio agreed to help authorities gather direct evidence by facilitating access to the basement during one of his mother's torture sessions. On the night of February 14, while Guadalupe was conducting what she intended as the Vega sisters' final ordeal, Aurelio unlocked the mansion's rear entrance and guided a small group of investigators directly to the basement door. What they found exceeded even the horrific expectations created by Aurelio's testimony. The basement chamber that investigators entered on that February night would haunt their memories for the rest of their lives. The scene that greeted them was so far beyond normal human experience that several officers immediately vomited while others had to be physically restrained from attacking Guadalupe on sight. The three Vega sisters were secured in their restraint chairs, their bodies bearing evidence of torture so systematic and prolonged that determining the full extent of their injuries would require weeks of medical examination. Esperanza was unconscious, her breathing so shallow that doctors would later express amazement that she had survived this long. Carmen was awake but completely unresponsive, staring at nothing while tears streamed down her face. Rosa, despite her terrible condition, was still alert enough to attempt communication with her rescuers, though the words she whispered were largely incoherent pleas for death rather than salvation. But it was Guadalupe herself who provided the most chilling aspect of the scene. When the investigators burst into the room, they found her calmly continuing her work, showing no surprise or concern at their arrival. She was dressed in what appeared to be a ceremonial version of her usual black clothing, and her manner suggested someone who had been expecting this interruption. "Gentlemen," she said with perfect composure, while still holding instruments of torture, "I assume you have proper authorization for this intrusion into my private household affairs." Her reaction, or lack thereof, revealed the depth of her psychological detachment from normal human responses. She seemed genuinely unable to understand why her activities might be considered criminal, referring to the torture sessions as moral instruction and the victims as students who required intensive guidance. The physical evidence found in the basement supported every detail of Aurelio's testimony while revealing additional horrors that he had been too traumatized to document fully. The investigators discovered detailed records that Guadalupe had kept of her torture techniques, including drawings and notes that showed she had been systematically experimenting with different methods of inflicting pain. They found medical instruments that had been modified for torture purposes, restraining devices that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of human anatomy, and most disturbing of all, a collection of personal items taken from victims that served as trophies of her conquests. But perhaps the most damaging evidence was the journal entries that revealed Guadalupe's complete awareness of her crimes' nature and their impact on her victims. Far from being driven by temporary insanity or uncontrollable impulses, she had planned and executed her torture sessions with the methodical precision of a scientist conducting experiments. October 15, 1892. The eldest sister's resistance continues to provide excellent opportunities for demonstrating consequences to the younger ones. Pain shared among family members seems to multiply exponentially rather than merely adding together. This technique should be refined further. November 3, 1892 discovered that the middle sister's psychological withdrawal can be temporarily reversed through specific applications of threat to her siblings. The human capacity for protective instinct appears to override even severe mental damage under proper conditions. December 12, 1892. Beginning to plan final phases for current subjects. Their deterioration has reached the point where continued experimentation yields diminishing returns. New acquisitions will be necessary soon. The arrest of Guadalupe Martinez de Bejarano on February 15, 1893, created a sensation that eclipsed every other news story in Mexico. For the first time in the nation's history, authorities had uncovered evidence of serial murder committed by a woman. And not just any woman, but one of Mexico City's most respected charitable figures. The contrast between Guadalupe's public image and the reality of her crimes was so extreme that many people initially refused to believe the accusations. How could a woman who had donated thousands of pesos to orphanages and churches, who had been praised by archbishops and government officials, who had maintained perfect social standing for decades, possibly be capable of such monstrous acts? But the evidence was overwhelming. The physical condition of the surviving Vega sisters provided undeniable proof of systematic torture. The basement chamber contained instruments and facilities that could serve no purpose other than the infliction of suffering. Most importantly, Guadalupe's own journals documented years of criminal activity with a level of detail that made denial impossible. The preliminary hearings began within days of her arrest, conducted in a courtroom packed with journalists, social reformers, and curious citizens eager to glimpse the woman who had hidden such terrible secrets behind a facade of respectability. Guadalupe's behavior during these proceedings provided additional evidence of her psychological abnormality. She showed no remorse for her crimes, no concern for her victims' suffering, and no apparent understanding of why her actions were considered criminal. When asked to explain her torture of the Vega sisters, she responded with the patience of a teacher addressing particularly slow students. These girls came to me as ignorant country peasants with no understanding of proper behavior or moral responsibility, she explained in a calm, reasonable tone. Through intensive instruction, I was helping them achieve spiritual purification that would benefit them in this life and the next. The fact that this process involved some temporary discomfort was regrettable but necessary. Her complete inability to recognize her victims as human beings with rights and dignity revealed the extent of her psychological pathology. To Guadalupe, the girls she had tortured were not people but objects to be manipulated for her satisfaction, their suffering merely a byproduct of what she saw as legitimate experimentation. The prosecution, led by Mexico's most prominent criminal attorney, presented a case that was both comprehensive and horrifying. They documented not only the immediate crimes against the Vega sisters, but also the previously unknown murders of Casimiro Juarez and Elena Santos, supported by Aurelio's testimony and physical evidence recovered from burial sites that Guadalupe's journals had revealed. Medical experts testified about the sophisticated nature of the torture techniques, emphasizing that the precision and variety of methods used demonstrated extensive planning and knowledge of human anatomy. They noted that Guadalupe had clearly studied the effects of prolonged suffering, developing techniques that maximized pain while avoiding immediate death. Most damaging of all was the testimony of church officials who had been investigating reports about the Bejarano household for months before the final discovery. Their evidence showed that Guadalupe's crimes had been an open secret among Mexico City's elite, hidden not by lack of knowledge, but by unwillingness to confront uncomfortable truths about someone whose social standing made her seem above suspicion. While the legal proceedings unfolded, Guadalupe's story captured the attention of José Guadalupe Parda, Mexico's most famous popular artist. Parda, known for his illustrations of current events and social commentary, saw in the Bejarano case a subject that demanded his particular talents for revealing the hidden darkness beneath surface respectability. Working from courtroom sketches and witness testimony, Posada created a series of engravings that captured both the horror of Guadalupe's crimes and the social conditions that had enabled them. His illustrations showed not just the physical aspects of torture, but the psychological dynamics that had allowed such systematic cruelty to continue undetected for years. The most powerful of these works depicted Guadalupe in her basement chamber, surrounded by instruments of torture while her victims suffered in the background. But what made the image truly disturbing was Posada's decision to show her as perfectly composed and elegantly dressed, emphasizing the contrast between her civilized appearance and her monstrous actions. These illustrations were widely distributed throughout Mexico and beyond, ensuring that Guadalupe's story would become permanently embedded in popular consciousness. They also served an important social function by forcing viewers to confront the reality that evil could hide behind any facade, no matter how respectable or socially acceptable. The trial of Guadalupe Martinez de Bejarano concluded in September 1893 with a verdict that satisfied few observers, but reflected the legal limitations of the era. She was found guilty of 2 counts of murder in the first degree and multiple counts of torture and assault, but the death penalty that many demanded was not imposed. Instead, she received a sentence of 10 years and 8 months in prison, a punishment that was widely criticized as inadequate for the magnitude of her crimes. The relatively light sentence reflected both the legal system's inexperience with serial murder cases and the continued influence of social attitudes that made it difficult to impose maximum penalties on women, even those guilty of the most serious crimes. Aurelio, despite his cooperation with authorities, was sentenced to 2 years in prison for complicity in his mother's crimes. The court recognized that his fear and psychological damage had prevented him from acting sooner, but maintained that he bore some responsibility for failing to report murders that he had witnessed over a period of years. The surviving Vega sisters faced a more complex form of justice. Esperanza died within weeks of her rescue, her body finally succumbing to the accumulated damage of months of torture. Carmen and Rosa survived physically but remained permanently damaged psychologically, requiring institutional care for the rest of their lives. Guadalupe was imprisoned in the notorious Cárcel de Belén where her reputation preceded her. The other inmates, many of whom had committed violent crimes themselves, were so horrified by the nature of her offenses that she was forced to live in solitary confinement for her own protection. Even in prison, she maintained her belief that her actions had been justified and necessary. Guards reported that she spent her days writing in new journals, developing theories about human nature and moral improvement that built upon her years of experimentation with torture victims. Guadalupe's prison experience proved that even the most sophisticated predators eventually face consequences for their actions. The other inmates at Carril Dillon might have been prostitutes, thieves, and murderers, but they drew the line at child torture. Word of her crimes had spread through the prison community, creating a level of hatred that made her daily existence a form of torture itself. She was forced to remain in her cell for 23 hours each day, emerging only for supervised walks in a small courtyard where she was subjected to a constant barrage of threats, curses, and projectiles thrown by other prisoners. The guards, many of whom had families of their own, made little effort to protect her from this harassment. But perhaps the most fitting aspect of her punishment was the way it stripped away the social standing that had been so crucial to her crimes. In prison, her former reputation as a respectable lady meant nothing. She was just another criminal and one whose particular crimes marked her as the lowest form of life in the prison hierarchy. Her health began to deteriorate rapidly under these conditions. The woman who had taken such pride in her elegant appearance became haggard and unkempt. The authoritative voice that had commanded respect in Mexico City salons was reduced to pleading whispers when she tried to communicate with guards or fellow prisoners. Most significantly, the isolation that had allowed her to conduct her torture sessions undisturbed became a punishment that she found unbearable. Guadalupe had always defined herself through her control over others, and the complete absence of victims to manipulate left her psychologically rudderless. She died in her cell during the winter of 1895, just 2 years into her sentence. The official cause of death was listed as pneumonia, but prison officials privately acknowledged that she had been found with injuries consistent with assault by other inmates. No investigation was conducted and no charges were filed. Even in death, she was accorded no more respect than she had shown her victims. Her funeral was attended only by a priest who performed the service as a matter of duty rather than compassion. No family members claimed her body. No friends mourned her passing, and no newspapers noted her death with more than a brief mention. The woman who had once been one of Mexico City's most prominent citizens disappeared from history as anonymously as her victims had vanished from life. The case of Guadalupe Martinez de Bejarano fundamentally changed how Mexican society understood criminal behavior and social respectability. For the first time, the nation was forced to confront the reality that monsters could hide behind any facade, that evil was not limited to the desperate and dispossessed, but could flourish in the most privileged circumstances. The investigation revealed systemic failures that had enabled her crimes to continue for years. Police had ignored reports from families searching for missing daughters because those families lacked the social standing to demand serious investigation. Medical professionals had provided equipment and expertise for torture without questioning their clients' intentions. Religious authorities had accepted her charitable donations while turning blind eyes to obvious signs of abuse occurring in her household. Most disturbing of all was the discovery that many members of Mexico City's elite had suspected the truth about Guadalupe's activities, but had chosen to maintain silence rather than confront someone whose social position made accusations dangerous. The case exposed a culture of complicity that valued reputation over justice and social harmony over human life. These revelations sparked significant reforms in Mexico's criminal justice system. New laws were passed requiring investigation of missing person reports regardless of the social status of those making the reports. Medical professionals were subjected to stricter oversight of their equipment sales and patient relationships. Most importantly, the legal concept of serial murder was formally recognized with enhanced penalties for systematic killing. But perhaps the most lasting impact of Guadalupe's crimes was the way they changed popular understanding of evil itself. Parda's illustrations ensured that her story became part of Mexican folklore, a cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting appearances and the importance of protecting society's most vulnerable members. The basement chamber where she had conducted her torture sessions was discovered by workmen decades later during renovation of the property. Even after years of abandonment, the room retained an atmosphere of horror that made strong men flee in terror. The building was eventually demolished, but locals claimed that the screams of Guadalupe's victims could still be heard on quiet nights. This mystery shows us that evil rarely announces itself with obvious signs and dramatic gestures. Instead, it hides behind respectability, operates within systems of trust, and exploits society's reluctance to believe that monsters can wear familiar faces. Guadalupe Bejarano's crimes were possible, not because she was superhuman, but because she understood how to manipulate the social structures that were supposed to protect the innocent. Her story reminds us that the most dangerous criminals are often those who appear most normal, most respectable, most worthy of trust. They count on our reluctance to believe that people we admire could be capable of unthinkable acts, and they use that reluctance as camouflage for their predatory behavior. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or do you think Guadalupe took other secrets to her grave? Leave your comment below sharing your thoughts about how society can better protect its most vulnerable members from predators who hide behind masks of respectability. If you enjoyed this tale of Mexico's first female serial killer and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves dark mysteries. See you in the next video where we'll continue exploring the shadows that history tried to forget.